While people have been living in the Americas for thousands of years, Europeans had no idea that two massive continents existed between them and China. The Vikings were one of the first Europeans to discover America. They discovered Greenland, which is part of North America, in the 10th century, and Leif Erikson traveled into North America in the 11th century. He traveled through what is now modern-day Newfoundland, Labrador, and other Canadian provinces on the east coast. There is a debate on how far the Vikings actually traveled, because they did find ruins in eastern Oklahoma, but the datings on the ruins don't really support the evidence. Erikson's discovery of North America wasn't widespread news to most Europeans. Around 500 years ago, Christopher Columbus secured an expedition from the Spanish crown and discovered the Bahamas. He went on to explore much of the Caribbean in his first 3 voyages, and then discovered the coast of Central America in his 4th voyage. John Cabot was Italian like Christopher Columbus, but he sailed for England in 1497 and rediscovered some of Leif Erikson's discoveries along with Nova Scotia. Amerigo Vespucci was a 3rd Italian explorer who sailed along the northeast coast of South America, mapping much of the coastline. Ponce de Leon searched the Caribbean for the rumored Fountain of Youth, but discovered Florida in 1513 and died in 1521 from an attack by the indigenous people in Florida. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was the first European to see the Pacific from the Americas in 1513 and explored much of Panama and northern parts of South America. Don Hernán Cortés de Monroy y Pizarro Altamirano Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca led an expedition into Aztec-controlled Mexico in 1519 and captured the city of Tenochtitlan in 1521 and traveled north to discover Baja California near modern-day La Paz in 1535. That same year that Cortés left Mexico was the same time when Magellan left on his expedition to circumnavigate the Earth. He explored much of the eastern South American coast, traveling through the Strait of Magellan, and sailed close to southern Chile. He was later killed in the Philippines, but the remaining crew arrived back in Spain in 1522. Once again, another Italian explorer, Giovanni de Verrazzano, explored much of the eastern seaboard in 1524.
Pedro de Alvarado traveled with Cortés in his conquering of the Aztecs. After this, he led an expedition into Guatemala in 1523 and then Honduras in 1539. Francisco Pizarro led an expedition into South America in 1531 and discovered the Incan Empire, which he conquered for Spain. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed down the St. Lawrence River, exploring much of the region for French fur trappers. Diego de Almagro was a friend of Francisco Pizarro, and they explored Colombia and conquered the Incas together. In 1534, Almagro led an expedition into Chile and explored much of the region. Hernando de Soto was another man who aided Pizarro against the Inca, and he eventually traveled to Florida, where he led an expedition through much of the American southeast and discovered the Mississippi River. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado led an expedition in search of the 7 cities of gold through the southern United States, making it as far as Kansas. Francisco de Orellana was another to help Pizarro improve. Man, this guy had a lot of friends. He explored the Amazon River, discovering large swaths of northern South America. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed up the California coast, discovering the bays of San Diego and Monterey. Juan de Cavallon led an expedition in Nicaragua and Costa Rica in 1561. During Francis Drake's expedition, he discovered a region in California that is just north of San Francisco Bay. And Sir Walter Raleigh sailed to North America, discovering parts of the eastern seaboard. John Davis discovered the Falkland Islands in 1592. Samuel de Champlain continued Cartier's journey and discovered areas in eastern Canada and New York in 1609. Henry Hudson attempted to find the Northwest Passage, but discovered the bay that bears his name instead in 1610. Grossier explored the Great Lakes from 1653 to 1660. Jacques Marquette and Jollet, another 2 Frenchmen, were the first Europeans to sail down the Mississippi River in 1673. The French achieved more glory when René Robert Cavelier de La Salle explored the northern Appalachian Mountains from 1670 to 1682. Pierre Gaultier de Varennes et de la Vérendrye, man, do these Frenchmen have long names, and he explored from Montreal to Lake Winnipeg from 1732 to 1739. Vitus Bering was a Danish explorer who sailed. Anthony Hinde traveled through western Canada and made it to the Upper Rockies from 1754 to 1755. Samuel Hearne, another English explorer, traveled north of Hinde to go past the Great Slav Lake and make it to the Arctic Ocean from 1770 to 1772. Juan José Pérez Hernández led an expedition in 1774 to the Pacific Northwest, making him the first European to discover Vancouver Island. 4 years later, in 1778, James Cook made an expedition along the Pacific coast and explored Vancouver Island more than Hernández had. Alexander Mackenzie sailed through what would become known as the Mackenzie River from 1825 to 1827, where he explored large parts of northwest Canada and Alaska.
Perhaps the most famous of North American expeditions is that of Lewis and Clark, who left the eastern United States and explored newly acquired territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean and Oregon from 1804 to 1806. Zebulon Pike was another American explorer who led a military party into Louisiana Territory and even went further into new Spanish lands. He traveled up a mountain in Colorado but never reached the top as snow covered his men and descended back down. Even though he didn't make it to the top, the mountain became known as Pikes Peak. Simon Fraser led an expedition in 1808 on Fraser River to Vancouver and was able to map out much of that area. Davis Thompson explored much of the northwestern regions of Canada from 1784 to 1850 and basically filled in the map for the rest of the country. Between 1819 and 1825, William Edward Parry explored the Arctic and discovered many of Canada's northern islands. Parry joined on expeditions with Sir James Clark Ross and his nephew John Ross. Between the two Rosses, they also discovered many of Canada's harsh northern islands. Jedediah Smith was an American fur trapper and broke many trails between eastern Canada and the U.S. Pacific coast. Otto Sverdrup was a Norwegian explorer who discovered Canada's most northern islands, known as the Sverdrup Islands, from 1898 to 1902. Maybe an inspiration for Indiana Jones, Percy Fawcett was an archaeologist who traveled into Brazil and Bolivia in 1906. And perhaps one of the most surprising explorers of the last remaining uncharted areas of the Americas was President Theodore Roosevelt. He lost the presidential election in 1912, and a year later the 55-year-old former president joined Cândido Rondon to explore the interior of South America, much of which was in Brazil.